Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to be discussing the carbon cycle. But first, what is carbon? Well, carbon is an element, which means it is a type of atom, and you can find our friend carbon right up here near the top of the periodic table of elements. It turns out that carbon is an ingredient that we find in a lot of the materials on Earth. Some examples are carbon dioxide, which is one form of carbon that we find in the atmosphere. Another form of carbon is a diamond, that is a pure form of carbon. You also might be surprised to learn that there is a lump of carbon sitting between your chair and your computer screen right now, and that is you. Humans are what we call carbon-based life forms, and just like every other organism on Earth, we are made, at least in part, of carbon. So carbon can take many forms on Earth, but the amount of carbon on Earth is fixed. What that means is that Earth isn't gaining new carbon, and it's not losing carbon either. Instead, the carbon on Earth is kind of being shuffled around to different places. And that shuffling and transformation of carbon is what we refer to as the carbon cycle. And so here is our diagram of the carbon cycle. And what it's showing are the different carbon stores. That's the name we give to the different places on Earth that carbon is stored, and the processes that transform and transfer carbon from one carbon store to another. And those are represented by the arrows. So let's take a look at some of these carbon stores. And let's start with one that you're probably familiar with, and that is the atmosphere. Here, carbon is stored in the form of CO2. Another carbon store is something called the biosphere, and that is the carbon that is actually making up the bodies and structures, the materials of different organisms on Earth. Another carbon store is the lithosphere, and that's all the carbon that's stored in the rocks, minerals, and sediments that make up the Earth. And another carbon store is the ocean. We have carbon that is dissolved in the ocean water in the form of carbonic acid or bicarbonate. Now let's look at some of these processes that transfer carbon from one store to another. And let's start with the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is transforming and transferring carbon from the atmosphere, one carbon store, into the biosphere, which is another carbon store. And what it's actually doing is those plants or maybe algae that are in the ocean, they are using the CO2 in the atmosphere, and they're using the energy from the sun, and they are actually transforming that CO2 into a material called glucose. And they use that carbon to actually build their own bodies with. That carbon might be transferred to another part of the biosphere if this cow comes along and eats that grass or those plants. Carbon can also be transferred back to the atmosphere through a process called respiration. And hopefully this is a process that you are performing right now. It's kind of a fancy term for breathing. Because when we breathe, we are taking in oxygen from the atmosphere and we are exchanging it for CO2, meaning we are releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. And so, fun fact, when we lose weight, it is actually because we are releasing that carbon. We're performing respiration and releasing that carbon that is actually part of our bodies. And thus, if we release enough carbon, we start to lose weight. So now our carbon is back in the atmosphere, and that carbon can be freely exchanged with the ocean. So when CO2 comes in contact with the ocean surface, that can dissolve and form what's called carbonic acid. And this process is what is leading to ocean acidification, which we're going to talk about in one of the next videos. Another form of carbon in the ocean is the carbonate ion, and that is what the critters that are in the ocean, they use that carbonate ion to actually build their shells. They are pulling some of that dissolved material out, and they're actually building their shells with that material that is dissolved in ocean water. Now, eventually, those sea critters will die, and the bodies and shells that are made of carbon will settle down to the ocean bottom. And depending on the process, those materials might turn into limestone, which is a rock that is formed from carbon, or possibly, if it's buried deep enough and there's enough compression, it could become a fossil fuel. Now, that fossil fuel, it can release carbon back into the carbon cycle through volcanic outgassing. Typically, we think of volcanoes maybe erupting lava, something like that, but they also are releasing a lot of gases that were previously stored as fossil fuels in Earth's lithosphere. So that process is removing carbon from the lithosphere and transferring it to the atmosphere through volcanic outgassing. Now, for most of Earth's history, volcanic outgassing has been the primary mechanism that has transferred carbon from down in the lithosphere up into the atmosphere. And this has been a control on Earth's climate. When that carbon is down in the lithosphere, it is not having an effect on the climate. But once it's transferred into the atmosphere, that's when it starts affecting Earth's climate. More recently, since the Industrial Revolution in 1850, humans burning fossil fuels has been the dominant mechanism transferring carbon from in the lithosphere up into the atmosphere. And so this is a huge change in the carbon cycle. And the rate that carbon is being transferred from deep in the earth as fossil fuels up into the atmosphere exceeds what was naturally happening in Earth's history. Okay, so we've seen the places that carbon is stored. We've seen the process that transfers carbon from one store to another. But let's get an idea of how much carbon is actually in these different stores. This chart is showing our different carbon stores in this column, and then it's showing the percent of carbon, the total carbon on Earth, that is stored in that particular carbon store. So let's start with the lithosphere, and what we see is that the vast majority of Earth's carbon is stored in those rocks and minerals that make up Earth. And so the total carbon in the lithosphere is 99.985% of the total carbon on Earth. In a far distant second is the hydrosphere at 0.0076. And this is mainly our oceans, but also a little bit of the lakes and streams on Earth as well. And then we have the pedosphere, and those are the remains of organisms up in the caught up in the soil. The cryosphere, some of the frozen mosses and stuff closer to the poles. And then far second to last is the atmosphere at 0.0015, which might be surprising considering how much we hear about carbon in the atmosphere. But this little bit of carbon turns out that it has a big effect on our climate, the temperature of our planet. So that's why we focus on this small bit of carbon quite a bit. Then finally, the biosphere at 0.0012%, and this is that carbon that is caught up in the bodies of animals or forms the structure of any organism on Earth. Okay, in conclusion, there is a fixed amount of carbon on Earth. And the carbon cycle, it shows how carbon is transferred between different carbon stores, which are different parts of Earth where carbon is located, like the ocean, atmosphere, or lithosphere. Now, over geologic time, volcanic outgassing has been the dominant process that has been transferring carbon from the lithosphere into the atmosphere. But today, humans are the dominant process. from extracting and burning fossil fuels, transferring that carbon up from the lithosphere into the atmosphere.